It's a little known saga how BC became a global leader in the underwater tech space, bringing light to a part of our world usually shrouded in darkness. Now, that saga has been laid out in a new book, Deep, Dark, and Dangerous, the story of British Columbia's world class undersea tech industry. It's by author and maritime historian Vickie Jensen, who joins me now on the CityNews bookshelf. Welcome to you, Vickie.
Thank you, John. I'm delighted to be here.
Great, great. Thank you. First off, what made you write the book? Was it as simple as wanting to make the story more well known?
Well, that's a big part of it for sure. But sometimes, as you know, in your work, you meet people and they just resonate with you. They have a hook somehow. And I started doing that with both Phil Newton back when I was editing West Coast Mariner magazine, and also with Al Trice, who was one of the three founding members of HICO, which was the big company back in the 60s, along with Phil's Candive. And the stories I heard from them were just unlike anything I'd ever heard of. I mean, I've written about work for much of my career. And so I'm always fascinated. When I grew up, work was a very positive four-letter word in our household. And so I just wanted to know more about these guys. And you started talking with one and they would mention others. And pretty soon, over a period of 3 years, I interviewed 45 subsea pioneers. And it's interesting, we all live and work in this province and we drive it and hike it and bike it and walk it. But all the exploration we're doing is on the surface. And back when I was editing West Coast Mariner magazine, one of the readers came to me and said, "All right, you write about everything that happens on the water. What about what's going on underneath?" And I went, "What?" And that was probably the key that got me going. And I don't regret it. I mean, none of us really, and that's me included, when I started out, I didn't know what underwater work is like. I mean, I'd worked construction, but how do you do it 50, 60, 180 feet down? It's a different ball game altogether. And, surveying, I heard stories about people looking, the police contacting divers to go look for missing bodies. And I remember the first sonar story I heard was about a guy who was contracted to look, and he said, "We saw this image." And sure enough, on the bottom of the river, there was a guy in a sleeping bag wrapped in chains. And I thought, okay, you got my attention. So, these stories are amazing, but they make great scientific discoveries too. Verena Tunnicliffe, from just newly retired from UVic, was just inducted to be an officer of the Order of Canada. I mean, she's hugely responsible for a lot of the underwater hot thermal vents, safe areas now. So these are not dull people.
Certainly not. Now, going back to the beginning here, the undersea tech industry in BC dates back to about the mid-1960s, yet remains largely unheralded outside specialist circles. Why do you think that is?
I think partly it's just because nobody sees the work. It's just basically in another world. It's almost like any work that's done on ship. Unless you've worked on a ship, you don't know that you might as well be on the moon in terms of being self-sufficient. So it's just unknown work. But when one of the first readers of the book got done, he looked at me and he said, "These guys are real Canadian heroes." And I thought, you bet. It's just that they're unknown heroes. And so that was something I really wanted to correct. It's such a fascinating thing. And this accomplishment of becoming a world leader in subsea tech continues today. And that was sort of where I got in the last chapter of the book. After interviewing all these pioneers, if you will, or risk takers, I thought, well, is this a dying business? And so I started asking around, and no, I met amazing young people, many of whom are highly educated, but they're doing fascinating work. And we're also excited to know about the history of the industry because they just come into it recently. So that was interesting for me. And then that led me to go back to the original people I interviewed and said, well, what advice would you give to young people? And Jean-Marc Laframboise out of International Submarine Engineering in Coquitlam said, well, take stuff apart, don't be afraid to try. And he said, today, if we get a flat tire, what do? We all call BCAA. Nobody changes their own flat tire anymore. He said, you need to not be afraid to work with your hands.
Now, I want to get to the young folks in a bit here, but as you say, going back to the history, and you mentioned interviewing 45 people over the course of this book, lots of great characters, but it really starts with, as you mentioned, Al Trice and Phil Newton, two diving legends who, among other things, designed and built Canada's first submersible. How important are their contributions to BC's undersea tech industry?
They're huge, but they were also working at the right time, and they are the first to acknowledge that. In the 50s and early 60s, commercial divers were hardly getting to 100 feet, hardly. And within the next 3 decades, that went from 100 feet to working a mile down. That's huge advances in technology. And it's, in a way, even more significant than the space technology that was going on at the same time, because going underwater, you've got unbelievable forces of water pressure to deal with. And, that's the kind of thing, if you've ever had a plumbing leak, water can get in and spurt out anywhere. Well, this would be killer stuff. So it's interesting. Phil and Al were operating in the 60s, 2 different companies. Al was working with HYCO, which was the short, handy version of International Hydrodynamics Incorporated. And Phil had his construction company, CanDive. They were both pushing the limits back then. And interestingly enough, Al says, there were 3 of us guys working with HYCO at the beginning, and none of us really were clear about what we were doing. We just knew, having been commercial divers and knowing how rough it was, and it was kind of the Wild West back then in terms of regulations for diving. We just knew there had to be a better way to get deeper, safer. And that's what led to the development of their very first Pisces. And so it's an amazing story.
And really, they go from strength to strength. HYCO with the Pisces submersible, and then Phil Newton, of course, with the Newt suit, and later the Exo suit. So these are huge developments, and all done locally here in the Lower Mainland.
You got it. It's amazing. There are so many people. There's in sonar, Willie Wilhelmsen and Helmut Lansinger, who just saw a need, and Helmut would be out on the ships, seeing what the well drillers needed, and he'd talk with Willie and say, can you come up with something like this? And then it was immediately tested. So it was that good trial and learning by failure. And everybody tested themselves in this business. You tested your body, you tested your equipment, you tested your inventions, you tested your financial resources. And there were lots of failures and flubs, but the amazing thing about these guys is that never stopped them. They said, okay, well, we learned from that. Now, what did we learn, and how are we going to change it? They just didn't believe that stuff was impossible. But again, they were at that remarkable time of huge technological development, lightweight materials, which make a big difference, all kinds of developing communication systems that were helpful. So, yeah.
Now, as we've been talking about, there are so many great first-person accounts in this book. Some of the principals certainly getting on in years too. For instance, by my math, Phil Newton, almost 80 years old. What was it like gathering all these voices and getting them to go on the record really before it's too late?
John, that was probably the delight. Everybody felt so delighted that this story was finally going to be told. I mean, they had been waiting for this to happen, and several attempts had evidently been made in the past. But there wasn't one person who was reluctant to talk. And they were just truly excited by the collaborative effort that we involved in. And so I would often sit down with them over lunch or sometimes on the phone, but almost always in person. We'd talk, record the interview, I'd get it back to them to take a look at, and then they'd say, "Oh, that reminds me of," and we'd go from there. It was wonderful.
Now, we've talked about the Pisces and the Newt suit putting BC on the map as far as undersea tech is concerned. How big of a business is this today, and where do you see this going next?
Wow, I'm maybe not the person to ask for that, but my outside observation is that there are companies, when I started asking people of, for suggestions of people to talk to in the industry, I heard the names of companies I'd never heard of. And I've been writing about this business for 20 years at least. So that to me, they're very, in some cases, very specialized companies, but they're throughout the province. For example, there's Inukton up in Nanaimo. And when I spoke with Al Robinson, who was one of the founders of Inukton, he said, nobody knows what we do here. We're globally, people know Inukton, but not locally. And I heard that over and over again. The same with Willie's company, Imagenics, in Coquitlam. A lot of the companies are in North Van or on the island or in Port Coquitlam or Coquitlam, because it originally cost less to have office space there, but having access to the water was also awfully important for a lot of testing.
Now, the book closes with a chapter about young people looking at building careers in the undersea tech space. What did you learn from them, and what kind of advice did they have?
Fantastic advice. And young people in the business had advice too, but it was some of the older ones that I really enjoyed. Almost to a person, they said, get some education. When they started in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, it was kind of like working on a tugboat. You could just, if you were willing to work and had a pair of work boots, you could do it. But now you need at least a BA or a degree of some sort from BCIT. If you want to go further than that in coding or all kinds of things like that, you need to get an education. And they said that's key to getting started. But then they extol the value of working for a small company to begin with, because you get to do it all. You have to do it all. And that's how you learn, rather than just becoming so very specialized in one little area. And they said, if you can, sure, maybe you're learning how to build something in a lab, but you need to get on a ship and take it out and see how it's deployed, see how it works, see how it fails. What can you do? And because repairing something in the lab is quite different than repairing something in water conditions at sea, then how do you make it easily repairable if there's a problem when you're at sea? And a lot of this work, I mean, companies like ISE are bipolar, I laughingly say. They have, run their vessels and their equipment in both the Arctic and Antarctica now. Pretty rare.
I think the last word should probably go to Phil Newton. I keep coming back to him because it's a great line. It's a great piece of advice, it sounds like, for this industry, but perhaps all industries, where he says, the most important thing now is to figure out what you want to accomplish. I know that's not easy, but be decisive and do it. And remember that the road of life is paved with flat, dead squirrels who couldn't decide.
My favorite line too, in the whole book. I love that one. But it is, it is good advice. And I think often young people today expect to have it all right away. And what Phil is saying, just get started, just decide and get started, and then do the best you can. When my sons were trying to figure out what careers they wanted to do, I told them, just put one good line on your resume every year. You know, maybe it's first aid training, maybe it's working with somebody, maybe it's a volunteer job, but one good line on your resume.
All right. The name of the book is Deep, Dark, and Dangerous, the story of British Columbia's world-class undersea tech industry, and it's available from Harbor Publishing. My thanks to author Vickie Jensen.
My pleasure, John. Thank you.